Self-preservation is a principle that everyone is likely to be familiar with in some fashion. If you have ever been in a situation that has caused you to experience elevated fear, such that your mind thinks its conservation is at stake, then you have had a brush with self-preservation. In its most basic form, the primal instinct is the fight or flight response that awakens in these situations. But what if we broaden the principle to include situations that are not as life-threatening? Situations that are interest-related more than anything else. Before I continue any further, I should state what this principle is, in order to provide a working definition. The principle of self-preservation is an ingrained, unconscious notion in the human mind to keep itself alive. Its sole purpose is to provide for the continued preservation of the individual, which includes the ability to ascertain the means to preservation, such as food and water among other aspects. However, in modern usage this could be extended to include the ability to pursue interests that go beyond the necessities of life, aka the pursuit of happiness. Working with this definition, I will examine why such a principle is so important and how it relates to multiple facets of life in general. Immanuel Kant, in his Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, attempts to search for a universal principle of morality, also how one would go about uncovering it and then relate it to the world at large. He comes up with what is known as the categorical imperative, where it states that for any maxim it must be willed by the individual in such a way for it to become a universal principle. Kant's categorical imperative is not strictly a test of whether individual maxims can become universal per se, but rather a way of helping to understand how we think when it comes to objective morality. One example that would fail his categorical imperative test is the maxim of, "I should be able to lie when it suits me." How this fails is because if everyone abided by this maxim, then there would be total chaos. Nobody would be able to trust each other, and so it cannot be a universal maxim. It also fails to take into account the incidents where lying does not suit your interests, where it does more harm to you than good. Enough of his categorical imperative. What does Kant say about self-preservation? In chapter 1 of his Groundwork, he states that it is a duty to preserve one's life, and moreover, everyone directly wants to do so. But because of the power of that want, the often anxious care that most men have for their survival has no intrinsic worth, and the maxim "preserve yourself" has no moral content. Men preserve their lives according to duty, but not from duty. He states that this version of self-preservation, the one that is driven by wants, is not deserving of moral worth or praise. An individual acting from their desire to pursue political interests, for example, is not morally admirable. So, what actions of a self-preserving nature qualify for moral content or worth? Well, Kant cites two cases, remarking that adversities and hopeless sorrow have completely taken away this unfortunate man's relish for life, but his fate has not made him passively despondent or dejected. He is strong in soul and is exasperated at how things have gone for him and would like actively to do something about it. Specifically, he wishes for death, but he preserves his life without loving it, not led by any want or fear, but acting from duty. For this person, the maxim "preserve yourself" has moral content. Now consider this separate but comparable person. This person has been a friend to mankind, but his mind has become clouded by a sorrow of his own that has extinguished all feeling for how others are faring. He still has the power to benefit others in distress, but their need leaves him untouched because he is too preoccupied with his own. But now he tears himself out of his dead insensibility and acts charitably purely from duty, without feeling any want or liking so to behave. Now, for the first time, his conduct has genuine moral worth. Having been deprived by nature of a warm-hearted temperament, this man can find in himself a source from which to give himself a far higher worth than he could have got through such a temperament. It is just here that the worth of character is brought out, which is morally the incomparably highest of all. It is just here that the worth of character is brought out, which is morally the incomparably highest of all, is beneficent, not from preference but from duty. Kant's take on the self-preservation principle is that it only has moral fortitude when it is upheld for unselfish reasons, refraining from vainglorious pursuit of wealth, power, and so on. A person who upholds this principle for the service of others is far more admirable and thus has great moral esteem. As I think about Kant's perspective, I cannot help but wonder if that contradiction can hold up against attack. The contradiction that one should preserve their life not for the sake of their interests, but for the sake of others. Because in situations where you are only thinking of yourself, as in fight or flight situations, your only priority is to stay alive. You do not care about anything else nor about anybody else, but yourself. I do not believe that Kant would disregard the significance of upholding this principle in those situations. After all, if nobody was allowed to defend themselves from attack, then nobody would be alive to procreate the next generations. Yet Kant does not fully endorse the self-preservation principle as justification to carry out selfish deeds. But can we really tear away the selfish component from the maxim preserve yourself? We all have interests, hopes, and dreams that we wish to pursue. As such, we realize that we cannot pursue them once we are dead, and so we act with what time we have left to fulfill those interests. Therefore, it is just to uphold the maxim preserve yourself, because if we had no other rights but this one, then at the very least we would be able to support our self-preservation first, and then consider the well-being of others. I can see where Kant desires the upholding of the maxim preserve yourself, so that it is done from duty, a duty to be charitable to others. The example that hits closest to home is that of our families. Why do we work? Why do we strive for the best lives? It is because, for most of us, we have families that we wish to support and provide for. Parents need to safeguard their person because they have children who depend on them. That is the justification for their necessity in preserving themselves above all else. This would appear to satisfy Kant's opinion that preserving oneself should be done out of duty, especially duty to others. Parents conserving their well-being for the sake of their kids is indeed noble, but for Kant, this would likely only be deemed as such if that was the primary, or indeed only reason for carrying out such action. Does this mean that once a person becomes a parent, their desires and interests are thrown out the window? Not necessarily, and I do not believe so because the pursuit of some of their personal interests will benefit their dependents. The obvious example is the pursuit of increased material wealth, so they can provide the best lives for their children. Even though the children are too young to realize that interest themselves, just the fact that their parents have it will benefit them immensely. The true question at this point to ask is, well, what if somebody does not have those obligations? They have no family of their own yet, or they do not aspire to have one. What shall we say about them? Should they not maintain their self-preservation as fervently as the parents because they have no dependents? It would be preposterous to say no, to remark that the individual who has no dependents is less deserving of self-preservation. If these individuals who lack dependents only act in interest of themselves, this is not necessarily ignoble. It would be preposterous to argue that because the parents' only defense of nobility or honor is because they have their children present, a rather convenient opportunity for cover indeed, something the lone individual does not possess. However, this does not automatically signify that the individual is selfish. They can be charitable, they can act from duty, or they cannot. The concern I raised to Kant is that in cases where people preserve themselves for others, it should not automatically be denoted as noble. Some may do so for selfish reasons, like the person who helps the needy so they can post it on Instagram. On the flip side, the person who keeps to themselves, pursues their interests and minds their own business, should not inevitably draw the charges of excessive selfishness or callousness. To conclude, I remark that self-preservation is a maxim that is wholly necessary to the individual, as well as the collective group at large. Without this principle, there is no collective. I often think to myself that selfishness is necessary, but only to a certain extent. One must be able to provide for themselves first and foremost, before they can think to provide for others. If one is struggling to stay afloat financially, how can they even consider the prospect of granting charity, especially when they are desperate to avoid poverty themselves? This is not to say that one should not act charitably. One should act this way, but rather, they should do so in a way that does not jeopardize their well-being, or the well-being of their family if they have one. I acknowledge that the meaning of jeopardize is more subjective in these cases, but you get the picture. Kant's view on self-preservation with the implementation of duty is not a new idea. Yet multiple questions emerge from whether it is noble to pursue actions from duty. Also, is acting from an intended duty in the best interest of the individual, or the others he is meant to support? There will continue to be considerable debate as to how far this principle can go, whether it can be extended to preemptive strikes, or the ends justifying the means. It will require further discussion, and I look forward to elaborating on these ideas further in the future. One thing is clear, self-preservation is here to stay, as it exists in our minds unconsciously, compelling us forward in ways that we do not realize, without considerable rumination and introspection.